Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Colorado Municipal League's webinar on the 2023 Legislative Wrap-Up. I am Denise White. I'm your Engagement and Communications Manager here at CML, and just want to say thank you for taking some time with us to learn more about this topic today. We know how busy life, work, everything can get, especially Mondays, so we appreciate you taking time of your day to learn a little bit more and spend your time with us. Before we get started, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. To our elected officials who are registered and in attendance today, we just want to make sure that you know you will receive 1 university credit for your attending the training today or the webinar today. Just to let everyone know, we have about 80 people in attendance. So for all of our participants, we have muted your mics today. That can be a lot of background noise or a lot of time that we have to get back on and tell people to mute their mics. So, but we do want to encourage you to ask your questions, and you can do that through the question box on your control panel. If you are not familiar with this GoToWebinar platform, you should see up at the top of your screen here a little control panel, and there's a little orange arrow. If you click on that, that will minimize or maximize your kind of control tool for the webinar today. And you should be able to see under there this little question toolbar that you can type your questions in, and we'll see those, and I'll bring those up to the team when we get to the Q&A session later. So we will have a brief presentation from our advocacy team here at CML, updating us on what they've learned as well as the experience of this past legislative session, and we'll follow that up with Q&A. Again, please feel free to type your questions in as they come to you. I'll keep track of them so that we can rise those back up for answers here when we get to the Q&A section. I do want to remind everyone that we are recording today's session, just so you're aware we're recording, but also because we're going to supply this as a resource later, as well as with the PowerPoint you've got going on today as materials under our webinar and training links. So you'll be able to find that following today at the CML website, that's cml.org, under our training materials section. So without further ado, we'll dive into the material that you're all here for today. That's our legislative wrap-up, a review of the 2023 session. Let me see if I can get that out of my mouth. Where we're just going to learn about the happenings and the outcomes, as well as have a chance to ask questions about the issues that could affect your municipality. Our presenters today are Heather Stauffer, our Legislative Advocacy Manager, Megan McKillop, our Legislative and Policy Advocate, Molly Steineman, Legislative and Policy Advocate, and Jacqueline Turway, our Legislative and Policy Advocate as well. Hiding in the wings, you don't see him on screen yet, are Robert Sheasley, our General Counsel, and Rachel Bender, Associate Counsel, just in case we need them to help answer some questions later. And so at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Heather, our Legislative Advocacy Manager, and we'll dive into the material. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. We're very happy to be with you today. As Denise mentioned, this is the final installment of a 3-part series that we've had, webinar series throughout the legislative session. So in this part of the series, we're going to do a quick wrap up, highlight a few of our bigger bills that we saw go through, and kind of let you know the outcome of some of the things that we've been talking about throughout the session. And we will definitely want to leave a lot of time for questions. So please, if you have specific questions, go ahead and type those into the chat, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So we are in the middle of spring outreach meetings. If you didn't know, if you haven't already seen us, we'll likely be in an area near you very soon in the next few weeks to talk about more bills that passed and failed this session. Also, our annual conference, we'll go over the session and what bills passed a little bit more in depth. We also have our Laws Enacted publication that's coming out in mid-June, which will summarize thoroughly all the laws that impact municipalities that went through this session. And if you missed our laws for immediate attention document, those are laws that passed and will immediately go into effect that impact municipalities. That will be up on our website soon. So look for that. So in addition to myself, Denise mentioned, this is the advocacy team, Molly Steineman, Megan McKillop, and Jacqueline Turway, and I'll ask each of them to go over their issue areas once we get to their slides. For myself, I cover issues like natural resources and environment, building codes, elections, governmental immunity, oil and gas, open meetings and open records, severance tax, water and wastewater, water quality, and wildfire. So, and that has our contact information. If anyone has questions for us after this is done, you can go ahead and take a screenshot of that. It's also on our website if you'd like to contact us directly. We're always happy to answer specific questions. So just a few fast facts. The General Assembly finished their work just before midnight on May 8th. They adjourned, sine die. We were there at that point. We were there through the whole session and up until the very, very bitter end. So any bills left on the legislative calendar after the legislature adjourns die on the calendar. And knowing that fact really helps shape a lot of what we saw in the final weeks of the legislature. The mood was tense. I did not have a modern day picture, but I think that this sums it up pretty well. You know, in general, the legislature was working 16-hour days, the weekends for the last 3 weeks to month of the year. People were tired, fuses were short, so we saw a lot of drama kind of at the end of the session, especially. Some few dynamics that I wanted to go over that really shaped kind of the outcomes that we saw. You know, in the House, you have the House Democrats who increased their majority significantly in the last election, so much so that they had a veto-proof majority. So in order to kill any bills that were supported by the majority in the House, you had to flip 14 votes. As a nonpartisan group, sometimes that's a good thing for us, and sometimes that's a bad thing for us. 14 votes is a lot, but it's not impossible. We did see it a few times throughout the session. And when you have a majority of that magnitude, inevitably you're going to have some infighting. And we saw some conflict between what I would describe as the moderate Democrats and the far left-leaning Democrats, especially highlighted at the end of the session, as to what priorities should move forward, what bills ultimately met their demise. So that was kind of on full display there. In the Senate, you have the Democrats also increased their majority by 6 votes. So in general, however, I'd say the Senate Democrats are much more moderate than the House Dems, and a lot of bills that were backed by the House Democrats didn't fare as well in the Senate as I think some of the House Democrats would have hoped or expected. So you have that playing out in the Senate, and then the Republicans in both chambers decreased their numbers. So their goal and strategy really this session was to slow down the process as much as possible, to try to put the Dems in a position where they had to make deals, especially at the end of the session when you have bills piling up on the calendar. You're more inclined to make some deals with the minority party to try to get as much through as possible, because as I mentioned, anything left on the calendar dies. So in order to get their priorities through, the Republicans or the Democrats try to push as much through as possible. The Republicans are on the other side, filibustering, slowing the process down as much as possible. So that kind of gives you an idea of what was happening throughout the session. And then we'll go over some individual bills that we worked on and kind of give an example of how those things played out in terms of bills. So I'll hand it over to Megan to talk about probably our biggest bill this session, Senate Bill 213. Go ahead, Megan.
Thanks, Heather. And as you mentioned, this is one of the bills that died on the calendar essentially due to timing, and really because there was a lack of compromise between not only the governor's office, but the House sponsors as well as the Senate sponsor and the members of the Senate, excuse me. So as you've also heard in our previous legislative updates, Senate Bill 213 was the governor's priority bill regarding the creation of housing across the state. It was one of the largest attempts to preempt local authority that our organization has seen in recent memory. The introduced version of the bill would have impacted almost every single city in our state and would have mandated that cities allow accessory dwelling units or ADUs, middle housing, which includes duplexes, quadplexes. It started off as sixplexes though, so it was much bigger in scope, as well as cottage clusters and townhomes. The bill would have also mandated transit-oriented development in key corridors, which were very expansive and written in a very broad way, and transit areas, which were areas associated with rail stations. Excuse me. The introduced version of the bill also really transformed the Department of Local Affairs, which our local governments know of as an agency that assists them in applying for grants and building infrastructure projects, as well as housing projects, depending on what area you are in within that agency. But the bill really turned that from an assistance agency into a regulatory and enforcement agency. And in doing so, it would have cost much more than the bill had appropriated for the cost of actual development of housing. All of that money would have really gone to the Department of Local Affairs for implementation of rulemaking, enforcement, and other provisions. The bill was modified significantly throughout the process, and most notably in the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, where Senator Rachel Zenzinger and Senator Jeff Bridges were both no votes on the bill unless the land use preemptions were removed. So in that committee, there was a strike below that passed, and that became the bill essentially. And the bill really focused on DOLA creating model codes for local governments to implement or to adopt and implement if they so choose, as well, excuse me, as well as creating more engagement with local governments and other important stakeholders through a legislative committee and a statewide summit. We will likely see more legislation on this topic next session. And we anticipate the governor will come back with either this idea in one bill or piecemeal bills. But we really want to first thank all of you, all of our members, for showing up and waiting very many hours to testify in committee, reaching out to your senators and House representatives. And it was really an effort from the ground up. It really galvanized all of our members. And I think we've shown not only the General Assembly, but the governor himself that we are prepared to have a real conversation about how we can create more housing. And we want to be ready to do that. So stay tuned for more from our organization, as well as others that we partner with, to talk about how we are going to really be at the forefront of the conversation leading into next session. I think we can go to the next slide. House bill, one bill that did get through the process but got a lot less press and press coverage, was House Bill 1255, which prohibits local governments from enacting and enforcing what we refer to as growth caps or growth restrictions. The bill as introduced was really overly written and very broad and extremely complicated. And there's still some elements of that language that is not ideal for our purposes. However, it is much better than the introduced version. So the bill in its final form really focuses on restrictions of permit applications based on specifically and explicitly the population growth in a certain city. This is similar to a growth restrictions we see in Golden, Lakewood, and Boulder. Broomfield has repealed theirs, so currently there are only 3 municipalities that have one of these ordinances on the books. What this bill does is prohibit a city from enforcing that ordinance, even if it was voter approved. It also, as amended, allows for a 24-month moratoria within a 5-year period in order to update zoning or land use codes, recover from natural disasters like a fire or a flood. And it also allows for instituting an affordability requirement in your development. This is similar to how Lakewood's growth restriction is structured, where they allow for affordable housing development, but not market rate development. In any case, that bill did pass, and we can expect it to be signed by the governor. So it doesn't impact a ton of our cities, but we wanted to make sure everyone knew about it, especially with regards to that more legitimate moratoria that you still are able to use. And I think that's it for me for now, but I'll kick it off to Molly.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to kick us off by starting with some criminal justice bills here. The legislature still has a pretty significant focus on criminal justice reform as well as law enforcement procedures. So that's a big bulk of what I'm going to be covering today. Two bills that did pass this year are Senate Bill 254 related to search warrant procedures and Senate Bill 97, which relates to motor vehicle theft across the state. Senate Bill 254 was a little bit of a tricky one, and I think that it can really demonstrate the way that the legislature is currently approaching law enforcement. This one changes the way in which search warrants are going to be conducted going forward. It limits the ability to execute a no-knock warrant to instances in which there's credible life-threatening situations, and it changes some of the procedures related to knock and announce warrants. So the knock and announce warrants can only be executed during certain hours of the day. Law enforcement will need to be appropriately dressed in uniform with body cameras, and they would need to knock loud enough and wait a reasonable amount of time for an individual to respond to the knock for them to execute that search warrant. This was one that CML did have some concerns with, but this is something that the legislature was pretty motivated to address this year, and we were able to put some clarifying amendments on the bill and loosen it up a little bit for law enforcement, but we do understand that this will require some law enforcement training going forward. Senate Bill 97 was a positive bill that CML supported this year. Our executive board did direct us to be very proactive and productive in issues of auto theft because it has been increasingly challenging for our communities to address. Senate Bill 97 does take a good look at this issue by decoupling the value of a vehicle with the charges associated with the theft of that vehicle. Prior to this bill, if the vehicle was $2,000 or less, it was a misdemeanor. This bill goes ahead or went ahead and decoupled the charges from the value of the vehicle, and it kind of creates a new charging structure. So this was a positive bill that we believe would be productive to addressing motor vehicle theft within our communities. Next slide, please. A few other ones here. This is Senate Bill 170, extreme risk protection orders. The legislature did take a pretty good look at gun control and gun safety regulations this year. I wanted to highlight Senate Bill 170 for you because law enforcement BO orders are consideration for law enforcement. This bill was fairly narrow in its execution, however. It just includes licensed medical providers, licensed mental health care providers, educators, and district attorneys as eligible petitioners to execute an ERPO order. Outside of those additional petitioners, this bill does not change ERPO procedures for local governments. And then Senate Bill 249, this relates to false reporting of emergencies or swatting. Under existing law, there is a pretty narrow focus on swatting. It actually is pretty much tailored to bomb threats exclusively. This essentially expands that to include false reports of active shooters or something that would lead to a shelter-in-place order, and it does have correlating charges associated with that. CML was in support of this because I'm sure we all remember several months ago when there were coordinated swatting, mass shooter calls placed to several of our schools across the state. This is concerning because it it places pressure on law enforcement bandwidth and availability when these reports are not actually legitimate. Next slide, please. And then there's a few bills that we focused on this section that I believe will be coming back in future sessions, so I wanted to make sure that you had them on your radar. The first is House Bill 1249, Reduce Justice Involvement for Juveniles. This is the Raise the Floor bill that we did here last year. And essentially what this bill aimed to do was to increase the age of prosecution from 10 to 13, except in instances of homicide. Offenders aged 10, 11, and 12 would instead be referred to a County Collaborative Management Program or CMP to receive services related to the charges that they received. CML did have some concerns with this proposal, both from a municipal court jurisdiction concern. This was sort of eliminating existing municipal court jurisdiction, but also just some broader public safety concerns related to the charges that could potentially fall within this CMP bandwidth. This was one of the bills that was gutted in the very last days of session. As Heather mentioned, things were slowed down significantly and some deals had to be cut, and this is one of the bills that we did luckily see a deal made on it. And essentially the final version of this bill is going to be primarily focused on reporting and data collection for counties, but I want to ensure that everyone is aware that this is a conversation that will likely be ongoing with the legislature. They attempted to do this last year, they brought it back this year, and I can imagine that with this data that they will be collecting under the current bill from this legislative session, proponents of this idea will likely come back next year with a very similar concept. Another one is House Bill 1169. This is limiting arrests for low-level offenses. This would have required law enforcement to issue a summons in lieu of arrest for petty offenses, petty drug offenses, class 2 traffic misdemeanor offenses, and all municipal offenses for which there's no comparable state misdemeanor offense. CML was concerned about this proposal from a broader public safety perspective. There are instances in which law enforcement needs to be able to utilize arrest in order to address public safety concerns. And so that was our engagement on this issue. Luckily, the sponsor of this bill did choose to postpone her bill indefinitely or kill it when she brought it to committee. But this is something that several members of the legislature have a vested interest in, and I believe that we'll be continuing to see this idea coming forward, whether in a broader criminal justice package or just this exact same bill next year. Next slide, please. And then switching gears here over to my regulated substances part of the policy portfolio, Senate Bill 290, the Natural Medicine Regulation and Legalization Act, essentially implemented what voters approved under Prop 122 back in November. And there's two pieces here. There is the decriminalization of personal use and personal cultivation, and there's also the licensed structure with the healing centers and the facilitators for natural medicine. Senate Bill 290 essentially stands up that licensed and regulatory structure for the state. DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies, will be licensing the facilitators, and DOR, the Department of Revenue, will be licensing the healing centers. Those are state licenses, and local governments would not have the ability to ban the licensed framework of this type of proposal. Local governments did maintain and preserve the ability to regulate the time, place, and manner of licensed facilities, but there is no outright ban like we see with marijuana and other regulated substances. Senate Bill 290 also put some charges in place for illegal activity under Prop 122, so fines and penalties for unlicensed facilitation, open consumption, illegal cultivation, and unlicensed manufacturing, and peace officers will be authorized to enforce the provisions of the act. Just for a general timeline here, the departments at the state level would need to begin accepting license applications for these licenses starting at least by December 31st, 2024. So we do have a little bit of time, and there is a rulemaking that will take place over the summer. And we will continue to monitor this issue and advocate for a greater degree of local control going forward. Next slide, please.
All right, one of the big conversations this session had to do with accessibility. There were two bills that I wanted to highlight, 1302 and 1308. Both of these bills dealt with people's accessibility to either housing or to local and state government facilities. Both of these bills were postponed indefinitely by the sponsor, but continuing this theme of these will come back in some way, shape, or form. So I think it's something that we want to be aware of. 1302, the housing accessibility bill, we were concerned it increased local government's liability if you issued a permit and then that developer didn't follow the rules around an increased amount of units being accessible for persons with disabilities. So that really increased our liability, and it was pretty broad the way that they wrote it. So we did have concerns with that. And then 1308, the bill was very broad in the way that it was written. Originally, it would have required local governments to make every building in which a public meeting is held completely accessible to a person in a mobility device within 6 years. And then it increased the requirements around live streaming of video and audio that's recorded and accessible to persons with disabilities. required any person to be able to participate via video conferencing. And there are a lot of challenges that come along with that, especially as we get into our rural communities who may not have reliable access to broadband. It also kind of was in conflict with a lot of the open meetings laws. So we had a lot of concerns about both of these bills. Both of those were, as I mentioned, postponed indefinitely. And in their place, House Bill 1296, they created this task force to study the rights of persons with disabilities. And as part of that, there's going to be a subcommittee around access to access to the outdoors with persons with disability. The original draft we saw of this bill mostly dealt with the state's outdoors, state parks and things of that nature, but it's something to keep our eye on because we have a lot of parks and I don't know how they'll define outdoors. There also will be a subcommittee on attainability of housing for persons with disability. As I mentioned, they'll discuss some of those issues that were brought up in 1302, and then the subcommittee on the physical and programmatic access within state and local government for persons with disabilities. So that task force will produce recommendations to the governor and the General Assembly before January 30th of 2025. I do expect there to be more legislation around this topic probably next session, whether that deals with exactly what the task force is looking at, or other topics of this nature. I don't know yet, but it is something worth bringing up so we can be a little bit more proactive and really take this time to look at how we're providing these services to people with disabilities, because this conversation is going to continue. So, and then finally, just in this space, I wanted to talk about Senate Bill 244. House Bill 21, in 2021, House Bill 1110, the website accessibility bill. It was very broad and vague in the way that it was written, and it created a lot of confusion and concerns for us. Senate Bill 244 is a cleanup to that bill. So among the things that it does, it requires the Office of Information Technology to do a formal rulemaking around website accessibility, so we know exactly what versions of the rules there are, and we can take part in that as they go forward. There's no timeline for that yet, but I'll keep you updated when they begin that formal rulemaking. The Act also adds the word reasonable into the definition of accessibility, thereby allowing for some reasonable accommodations, which is more in parallel with what's currently required in the ADA. And then it clarifies that $3,500 can be awarded to a person for one violation per application. In the original bill, it was unclear, and so theoretically somebody could go through a website and pick out 5 or 10 things that were violations and get $3,500 each for those violations. This clarifies that it is per application and not per violation. So those are some things around accessibility that I wanted to highlight. And I'll turn it over to Jacqueline.
Hi, so one of my issue areas is broadband, and this year the most important bill in the broadband space, I would say, is Senate Bill 183. What this does is allow for any local government that has not held the vote as required by Senate Bill 5152 to allow for them to build out broadband infrastructure. It removes that requirement of the vote. So we had about 121 municipalities prior to this bill that had voted to be out from under the 152 requirements. Now everyone is. The act is in effect today. So if you're interested in participating in broadband infrastructure or building that out, even middle mile, public-private partnerships, you are able to apply for the grant funding in the summer grant cycle from the Colorado Broadband Office. And if you had already voted out, there is no change for you from this legislation. Now for employment, which is another one of mine. I would say the theme for employment this year was coming back with bills that had not passed in the few prior sessions, based on what Heather said earlier with the new spread of Democrats to Republicans in both the House, Senate, and then obviously the governor's mansion. House Bill 1045 is employee leave for Colorado National Guard service. What this does is say that any employee that's in the Colorado National Guard or reserve components of the U.S. Armed Forces are entitled to 3 weeks of leave from their employer. Prior, it was 15 days, which in a typical work schedule is 5 days a week for 3 weeks. What this is saying is if your 3 weeks are different schedules than that, it's just your normal 3-week work week that you are entitled to. Additionally, you can use unpaid leave, which was one of the main goals of the sponsor, was to be able to allow for these individuals after they reach their 15 days to be able to get unpaid leave so that they're not having to get into their vacation time to be able to serve the state or the country. Also 1091, some of our board members as well as policy committee members were very interested in childcare issues and increasing childcare with relation to employment issues in their area. What this does is it extends the current tax credit through 2027. The tax credit is equal to the lesser of 50% of your contribution up to $100,000 per year, or your actual income tax liability. So it is not based on profit versus nonprofit. It can go to any childcare facility in the state. The Department of Revenue is also going to be developing studies on the usage of this tax credit, because I know as a user of childcare, I had no idea this was an option. And I think that that is the case across most of the state. Additionally, they're going to be looking at how you can use land donations as well as in-kind donations like a reduced rent and a property for these childcare facilities. Some of the other bills, like I mentioned, that were brought back from prior sessions, Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. This is actually an update to the prior bill, and a lot of what's in it is probably going to be helpful for employers. Career progression does not need to be posted as an open position internally or externally anymore. What that means is if you have someone that's in like a financial analyst 1 position, and after they've been there 3 years and have completed some sort of test or something like that, they automatically move to a 2. You don't, and with that salary increase, obviously, you don't have to post that as an open position as you had to with the prior language, because technically that's not an open position, it's just career progression. The piece of this bill that CML was opposed to was the back pay for anyone found liable for this was increased to 6 years from 3 years. That's a significant increase in taxpayer liability for the funds that would be to go to literally double the back pay granted. Senate Bill 172, the Power Act. This one, I believe this is at least the 3rd iteration that I've seen of this bill. But basically, severe and pervasive is no longer part of the definition of harassment. So it does not have to be severe and pervasive. It just has to be something that is affecting any of the protected classes. And marital status is considered a protected class now. Additionally, for affirmative defense, employers must keep records of the complaints that they have for 5 years. And they also need to have some form of structure to be able to deal with these complaints when they come through as part of their affirmative defense. Senate Bill 53, restricting governmental non-disclosure agreements. Both in employment contracts and settlement agreements, we are no longer allowed to execute non-disclosure agreements unless they fall within a very minimal amount of exceptions. And these would be to do the normal course of business, like if you're working with a contracting company, or if there's some data privacy issues or cybersecurity issues, those things. I'm planning on putting something together a little more in detail before that becomes law officially in August, because it is very confusing. So keep an eye out for that. And then Senate Bill 58, the Job Application Fairness Act, beginning in July of 2024, employers may no longer ask age identifying information on an initial application. So you can't have on your application page birthday or graduation year. However, you can request transcripts, certifications, or other materials in the initial application, as long as you tell them that they are allowed to redact age identifying information. One of the things to note on this one is that it's only the initial application. So if they move forward into an interview process, or 2 or 3 interviews down the road, however that works for you all, you can follow back up and ask for the transcripts or the certificates without anything redacted. So that was one of the changes we got added in, that we could ask for these things redacted at the beginning of the employment process. Senate Bill 111, not as big as 213, but it's still a really big issue. It is not collective bargaining, supposedly, but it kind of is collective bargaining. We're still waiting if the governor is going to veto this legislation. We had a great meeting with them last week. Hopefully that comes to fruition, but in case that it doesn't, we want to let you know what's in it. The bill's very broad and ambiguous in the language. There's going to be a rulemaking at CDLE to go over what this really looks like for public employers. So we will participate in that if that does happen. What this bill does is give employees the right to discuss or express views regarding public employee representation or workplace issues, engage in protecting concerted activity for the purpose of mutual aid or protection, fully participate in the political process while off duty and not in uniform, including speaking to the public employer's governing body regarding employment issues, workplace issues, and any matter of public concern, and organize, form, join, or assist in an employee organization. There's a lot of issues in there. One of them is that, our municipalities do have the ability to collectively bargain and create employee organizations, but they have to hold a vote to do so, and this would remove that. There's no definition on what a workplace issue is, so it could be anything as menial as not liking the snacks in the break room and taking that issue to the public employer's governing body and creating a big issue over that. So there's a lot wrong with this. Public employers may not discriminate against, coerce, intimidate, interfere with, or impose reprisals on an employee for exercising any of those rights listed above. I do want to make clear that CML does not have a position on collective bargaining itself or creating a union. We are, whatever works for the municipality works for them, and that is our position on that. And which is why we have such a problem with this, because it would be statewide and not allowing for the municipal employer to have any input on that.
Okay, so I know I talked a little bit about land use earlier on, but that was not the only housing bill that we saw this session. There were the main focus of the legislature this year and the governor's office was creating more housing. In fact, 2 of the committees were renamed. The Senate Local Government Committee was now titled the Senate Local Government and Housing Committee, and same in the House. They renamed it Transportation, Housing, and Local Government to really emphasize the importance of housing through the entire state. Not only were there a lot of tenants' rights bills that did pass, which I won't really get into here today, but you can look for summaries of those in our laws enacted when that is released. But there were some bills that were aimed at creating or preserving more affordable housing and assisting local governments in creating more housing projects. One bill that CML did support was House Bill 1190, which would create a quote unquote right of first refusal for local governments to create more affordable housing. And this right of first refusal is really just an offer, a right to make an offer to match a market rate value offer from a seller of a multifamily property. And there are specifics regarding how many units must be included to be an eligible property. And there are lots of exclusions and waivers that are included in the bill. But one thing I really wanted to note is that a local government has the ability to disclaim all of this entire right, as it is called, either in its entirety, so the entire bill, or they're able, or in part. So a local government can, for instance, say that they would like to receive notice from a seller that a property is going to be put up for sale, and the local government will then have time to participate in a market transaction as any other seller or any other buyer on the market would. There were a lot of amendments that went onto this bill late in session, and again, we'll summarize those in more depth in our laws enacted and at our presentation during conference. House Bill 1304 is really a mostly technical bill regarding Prop 123, which passed this past November on the ballot, a voter approved measure that would create affordable housing programs and provide access to funds for local governments to create not only affordable housing projects, but to ensure that there's homelessness projects that are being fully funded as well. Among other things, the bill allows tribal governments to participate in this program. It also makes some technical cleanup to ensure that the correct agencies are responsible for the things that make sense. So OEDIT is responsible for specific things, and that's the Office of Economic Development and International Trade. And then the Division of Housing is also deemed responsible for a lot of some things, including just general administration of housing funding programs. It also establishes a process for rural resort communities to adjust their income percentages based on the area median income. A community who wants to adjust that and increase the AMI for which their affordable housing projects are based off of has to really apply to DOLA for approval and demonstrate the need for that change. Next slide, please. The last housing bill I want to talk about was actually the first housing bill that was introduced, which is Senate Bill 1, which was just signed Friday or just a couple days ago. This bill just makes it easier for the state to enter into public-private partnerships to create housing projects. And for the context of this policy, a local government is considered a private entity. So really what this does is allow state and local governments to more easily partner to create affordable housing projects. Next slide.
As you may have heard through the media, the property tax issue was a big one this year, particularly in the last few weeks of session. I do want to quickly mention though, Senate Bill 108. This allows temporary reductions in property taxes due. What this means is that if local governments voluntarily reduce their mill levies, they can return to the previously voter approved amount without having to hold an additional vote of their citizens. Some were already doing this. Some had some questions legally with respect to Tabor. And so this made it very clear that if you do a temporary reduction, you may go back to that previous amount that you had prior. Now, the last 2 weeks of session, actually last week of session, was with Senate Bill 303 and House Bill 1311. Senate Bill 303 is reduced property taxes and voter approved revenue change. What this does is place the referred measure Proposition HH on the ballot in November. It would reduce assessment rates from 6.7 from 6.765% this year and increases the assessed value exemption from $15,000 to $40,000 on your primary residence. Based on the backfill percentages, local governments will receive backfill until they reach their 20% assessed value increase from 2022. So at any point in the next 10 years, which is how long this bill is in effect for, if you reach above 20% increase from 2022, you no longer get the backfill. The senior homestead exemption is increased to $140,000 starting in 2025, and it is portable. So if they move to a downsize to a smaller home, something like that, it is a portable exemption now with Prop HH. Starting in 2023, growth in revenue limits from property tax revenue is limited to the rate of inflation in the Denver, Lakewood, Aurora CPI. Local governments may vote to exceed this through their governing bodies. That also is through Prop HH. And then the ballot question also lowers the Tabor cap and retains the funding for the state education fund, and then will backfill local governments. So that's how they're going to pay for the backfill piece. I will say that in the last day, the fire districts, hospital districts, and EMS got moved to the front of the line for the backfill after the state education fund. And those 3 types of districts will also receive 50% of their backfill allocation once they go over the 20% assessed value increase. Lots of percentages here, so hang with me. And then 1311 was introduced with 3 days left in session. And what this does is equalize the Tabor refunds for this year across the board while with voting for Proposition HH. So if you vote for Prop HH, the Tabor refunds will be equalized, and this new percentage and backfill situation will be happening for local governments. It's very confusing. happy to answer questions. I'm thinking we're going to look at how to get more information about this to our municipalities in the coming weeks and months. But that did pass in the last hour of session.
Municipal courts was not as active as it typically was, but I wanted to note our CML initiated legislation, which is House Bill 1132. This was brought forward through our policy process back in the interim. But really what this does is create a task force to look at the feasibility of incorporating municipal court data and district and county court data together. So the work will get going this summer, and they'll have to report back to the General Assembly in January. So looking forward to see what comes from that task force. In addition to that, two other bills that really were a kind of bigger deal. House Bill 1222 involves cases of domestic violence for municipal courts. There are about 5 municipal courts that currently see domestic violence cases. And what this does, this bill just makes some requirements of those 5 cases to ensure that victims and defendants both are receiving adequate services and defense respectively throughout the process of a domestic violence case. It requires those cities to pass some ordinances and fall in line with some specific guidelines. In addition to that, the Senate Bill 72 continues a program that was established in 2018 that reimburses local governments for first appearance services for indigent defendants. So that program will be continuing, and you can still apply for those funds through DOLA.
Okay, 2 bills to note from the open meetings, open records. Also not very active this session, but Senate Bill 286, this is access to government records. This is the CORA bill that has been talked about throughout the session in our last webinars. We anticipated that the Press Association was going to try to get discounts for members of the media for research and retrieval fees. Within that bill, we pushed back really, really hard against that. And that bill was introduced without that provision in it. So we actually went to neutral on this bill. It does make some small changes. Can't charge a per page fee for an electronic document, which is pretty standard practice already. And if you allow credit card transactions for other fees, you have to allow it for CORA research and retrieval fees as well. It also creates some provisions around records with an elected official as the subject of a sexual harassment investigation. It makes those final reports discoverable, but allows some redactions for witnesses' identities, accusers, and things of that nature. So that's something to pay attention to, but it's definitely not as bad as we were expecting in terms of those discounts for media. And then just quickly note House Bill 1259. This bill is in response to some predatory lawsuits that that attorneys are representing themselves are bringing primarily against school districts, rural school districts, but municipalities are also seeing those. They will bring a suit around tiny minor violations for open meetings laws as it pertains to executive sessions. If you use the wrong verbiage, if you cite the wrong revised statute, they'll bring a suit. So this bill just clarifies that a pro se plaintiff, someone who's representing themselves, does not get the cannot get an award of attorney's fees for an action brought against a public entity as it relates to this. So that is something to note if you're having those problems within your communities.
Very quickly, there wasn't a lot of sustainability activity during the session, at least for CML's purposes. But one thing I did want to note is we did pass House Bill 1285, which does a couple of things regarding the bag fee that was instituted through House Bill 1162. It does make a clarification that the remittance of the bag fee that goes to local governments does begin on a quarterly basis starting this year. And I know we've already passed the last quarter, which ended in April, but going forward, you can let your stores know that state law does reflect that the bag fee should be remitted on a quarterly basis. I know we had a big training on this before session started, and I know that was a point of contention, but there was action on that point specifically. And if your municipality does not have a way to collect that fee, or if you're choosing not to enforce it, since you do have that ability, this bill just allows for the store to retain that entire 10 cents for more sustainable products like reusable bags and things like that. Also, we'll see a study being done by CDPHE to look into composting and organics diversion. So really looking forward to what that study will reveal and how we can help local governments increase infrastructure and composting programs. Next slide, I think, is also me. Transportation was also pretty quiet this year. I'll touch on 1276 first, House Bill 1276. It's the Bridge and Tunnel Enterprise, which provides funding for bridge and tunnel projects throughout the state. This was really a technical bill that brought forward by CDOT and just made a couple efficiencies and clarifications regarding funding for that program. And House Bill 1101 expands the ozone season grant program, which our local transit agencies are able to use, are eligible for. And you're able to use these funds not only in July and August, but if you have a poor air quality month that is not within those 2 months, you're able to use funds during that time. And you're also able to use it for advertising and marketing, things like that. As part of this bill, the Transportation Commission also does have to look at the boundaries of the transportation planning organizations, which largely determines how transportation funding is distributed. So they will have to look at that by November of this year and make decisions on whether or not they're going to change those boundaries. Next slide. And just a couple other transportation bills. This year, we have expanded municipalities' ability to use automated vehicle identification systems. So currently, there's just a couple handfuls of cities that do have these systems installed. But in going forward in the future, if you'd like to expand, or if you'd like to install those systems, you're able to use put them in different corridors that were all in current law, which were limited to school zones and unsafe areas like that. But now you will be able to use them in high traffic corridors, whereas before you were not able to. It makes some clarifications on when and how you can install those systems, and makes it a little more efficient for local governments to implement. But we're really excited about the expansion of that program for our cities that currently use it and cities that don't have it at all. And then Senate Bill 268 was a bill introduced late in session that increases transparency at the Department of Transportation regarding their 10-year plan projects. And we really think it's important to give information to local governments about the length of those projects, how much they're funded, and when they're completed and things like that. So that's a bill that CML supported, and we're happy to see that that passed. That's it for me.
All right, so one quick note on wildfire, Senate Bill 166, the establishment of a WUI code board, Wildfire Resiliency Code Board. This is something that we had been following again since last session when it was they tried to add it onto another bill. That didn't work. They ran it as a bill this session, and that did pass. So by July 1st, 2025, that board will determine where the WUI is located, and then create some minimum codes that local governments have to, within that WUI, have to adopt. So if you know that you're located within the wildland urban interface, it's good to pay attention to this. And then just some quick notes on elections. House Bill 1185, requirements for recall elections and vacancies. This is CML initiated legislation. It makes a number of technical cleanups to Title 31 municipal election law. And then it also specifies that if there's a lack of a quorum sufficient to appoint a new council member, a city clerk can call a special election to fill vacancies. And this is in response to specific instances where an entire city council quits, and what happens next, who calls the election. House Bill 1245, this is for statutory cities primarily, but I will note that if you do not have campaign limits on campaign contributions as a home rule city, this will also apply to you. It takes effect January 1st, 2024, and then sets those statutes in law. It also makes changes around the number of reporting dates that candidates are required to report, and then also clerks are required to retain records for 6 years rather than 1 year. So that's something to note, especially if you are a statutory city. I just wanted to mention some additional resources. Our box score of support and opposed bills on cml.org. You can see that right now. As I mentioned earlier, laws for immediate attention. That will be up on our website shortly if you missed that in the newsletter. And then laws enacted document will come out in June. So please stay tuned for that. And I think we have just about 5 minutes and we'll take a couple questions. So please go ahead, Denise.
Thanks, Heather. And yes, we have had a couple questions come in, but I just want to remind everybody, please drop them into that question box, or if it's easier if you just chat, please drop it into chat so we can capture those here in these last few minutes. It's a lot to take in, so if you don't have all your questions lined up yet, you know how to reach us here at CML, and we'll be happy to follow up with you. You'll also be getting an email later this week linking back to this presentation with everybody's contact email as well. So don't panic if you can't come up with it in this next few minutes, but it comes to you later. But Jacqueline, I'm going to throw this back to you because I do think we have a question for you. And it's, are any local governments excluded from SB 23108, for example, metro or school districts?
Thanks for the question. The only exclusion piece is that school districts cannot reduce their mill levy below the Public School Finance Act amounts. However, the rest of it applies to all local governments.
Great, thank you. And then again, we're following up on 303 this time. So is everything in 303 can be done legislatively except for the Tabor refund part? And this is a correct, like, is that how they're thinking and interpreting? Is that correct? Do you want to expand on that?
Sure, yes, that is correct. The Tabor refund reduction is the piece that has to go to the vote of the people. Yes, I guess I'll leave it at that. Yes, they are correct.
Great, and we have a couple minutes left, or we can give those minutes back to you in your day, but I don't see any other questions in our queue right now. So we'll go ahead and just say thank you again to our presenters. This is my first session with CML, and I just am impressed with seeing how hard our advocates here worked for everybody on their behalf. So expressing my gratitude, and I know we see that from our members across the state as well. And then sharing your expertise and knowledge here today. For all of our members in attendance today and our audience, thank you. Again, we know how limited time is as a resource, so appreciate you spending it with us today as well. Again, if the question comes to you later, you couldn't get it answered today or didn't come to you yet, please reach out to us. Always here to help and help add some clarity there. As a reminder, this recording, the presentation slides, and some helpful links will be added to cml.org under our training materials section later this week. And you'll know when it's added because I've got a list of all of you registered today, and we'll send you a follow-up email so you know it's there and ready for you to tap into. I don't see any last minute questions. So I'm going to say thank you to everybody and let you know this concludes our webinar today, and wish you a happy Monday afternoon and a great week. Thanks.